In the last few years, Second Sight has issued a lot of collector's editions on Blu-ray and UHD, often of more recent movies than have generally had this extravagant treatment. New films, as I keep calling them, before realising that they're often now getting on for a couple of decades old. But the two latest are perhaps more in keeping with what other boutique labels are releasing in these fancy extras-laden box sets, being a pair of David Cronenberg films from the crossover point of the 1970s into the 1980s, and Cronenberg's reputation as just another bloodthirsty exploitation filmmaker into someone more respected as an artist. Still an outsider artist at this point, admittedly, but one that was increasingly outstripping his genre contemporaries. The Brood, shot in 1979, was David Cronenberg's third mainstream horror film, following Shivers and Rabid. It might seem odd to call these films mainstream. Commercial is probably a better descriptor, given that they came in the wake of the decidedly underground movies Stereo and Crimes of the Future. But while those two films were made as very personal and experimental zero-budget art house films, both Shivers and Rabid were pitched at the same audience that was watching movies like Night of the Living Dead.
If you think you're not afraid of the dark, if you think you have a strong stomach, if you feel nothing can shock you, if you say you don't scare easily, if you believe you've seen everything, you haven't seen David Cronenberg's Shivers and George Romero's Night of the Living Dead.
What was then called the drive-in crowd, now often referred to as grindhouse movies. That too is a bit of a misnomer, because these films played very mainstream cinemas around the world to very mainstream audiences. There is a tendency to think, amongst people who have no memory of films like this having a theatrical release, that everywhere that showed movies of this kind was a grim flea pit, populated by a mix of cult movie fanatics and the dregs of humanity. But the horror, exploitation and softcore sex films of the 1970s were being shown in the same cinemas that were showing Star Wars and Disney films. The Brood, the novelisation of which I have here, and very nice it is too, was, in retrospect, a conduit between these early Cronenberg body horror movies and his evolution into becoming one of the most original voices in modern cinema. It's a bolder film than its predecessors and more original. You can see how Shivers and Rabid are part of a collection of infection horror movies that included George Romero's zombie films and his much underrated The Crazies, alongside films like I Drink Your Blood. The Brood, on the other hand, is entirely original and a deeply personal story. So personal, in fact, that it seemed to deeply upset some of the critics in ways that most horror films didn't. Presumably because it triggered subconscious family traumas of one sort or another. Certainly it was given some scathing reviews that were much angrier than the sneering dismissal that greeted most horror films at the time. On the other hand, the film also saw some critics recognising that Cronenberg might just have more to him than they thought. That here was someone who could turn the horror film into a work of art, something that very few critics, even genre critics at the time, considered possible.
These remarkable infrared photographs were taken with a hidden camera. The audience was watching David Cronenberg's latest horror movie, The Brood. We dare you to watch The Brood. Oliver Reed and Samantha Eggar in The Brood, Certificate X. The nightmares will follow.
The Brood is a multi-layered, astonishingly bleak story based around the Sommerfree Institute of Psychoplasmics, where patients are undergoing a radical form of psychotherapy, being encouraged to externalize emotional traumas as physical afflictions. What scientist Dr. Raglan, played by Oliver Reed, refers to as the shape of rage. In the middle of all this, a father, played by Art Hindle, fights to save his daughter from his estranged and disturbed wife. The Brood was, despite strange and disturbing story ideas, Something of an autobiographical film for the director, whose recent divorce and subsequent custody battle had been both stressful and messy. In real life, Cronenberg had been forced to effectively kidnap his own daughter when his wife announced that she would be taking the child to live in a Californian religious community. He's referred to the film as his version of Kramer vs. Kramer, that tedious Oscar-winning divorce drama that had been released a year earlier. In this film, Art Hindle strives to save his daughter from Samantha Eggar, who has been externalizing her rage by creating psychopathic brood children that reflect her emotional state. When she feels threatened by her parents, a possible love rival, or even her own daughter, the mutant children attack the cause of the distress like an immune system fighting off pathogens. Given a bigger budget than he had on his earlier films, thanks to the Canadian tax shelter financing system of the time, Cronenberg could afford to cast a few name actors. Oliver Reed was a major international superstar, but by the end of the 1970s was more famous for his drinking bouts and bad behaviour than his actual acting. Often wasted in films he clearly had little interest in, it's easy to forget that Reed was a first-rate actor, and The Brood features one of his finest performances. Equally impressive is Samantha Eggar, an actress who, like Reed, had often been wasted in poor roles. She had an instinctive understanding of where Cronenberg was coming from with the film. She told me the script reminded her of things from her childhood, Cronenberg would tell Cinefantastique. She never got more specific than that. It's interesting, in retrospect, that even for several films after this, Cronenberg was still criticised by some for not being an actor's director. Watching the film again, it's clear how far off the mark that is. Reed, Eggar and Hindle all give excellent, subtle, honest performances that could only come from strong and sympathetic direction. While Shivers and Rabid were both very much within the apocalyptic template set by Night of the Living Dead, The Brood is altogether more intimate. It feels closer to the films that Cronenberg would start to make a few years later. The Dead Zone and Dead Ringers are possibly the closest comparisons in his horror career. And while we might expect horror films to lose their shock value over the years, what once seemed extreme now seems commonplace and overexposed, The Brood is remarkable in that it hasn't lost any of its potency in almost 50 years. In fact, it might be even more taboo now with its problematic scenes of children being exposed to violence and horror, its disturbed sexuality, its portrayal of women and mothers as monstrous and dangerous. If this was made now, critics would probably slate it as a men's rights diatribe. And a finale that's one of the most uncomfortably twisted moments in cinema history. It's really no wonder those angry critics felt the film to be a very personal punch to the gut. Anyone with young kids and anyone undergoing marital discord might still find the film almost unbearable. The raw emotional assault that it delivers is astonishing. This is not horror cinema's escapism, but rather a wrenching study of human frailty. It's not comfortable or easy viewing, and you might not want to watch it all that often, but it is a masterpiece. The film that Cronenberg followed this with was a very different sort of movie. If The Brood had allowed him to exercise some personal demons, then Scanners, again, the very nice novelisation, seemed to be his first step into the mainstream. This bigger budget sci-fi action film felt like several steps away from the extreme and into the more commercial, even if it did include an exploding head as its defining image. However, it also marked a return to the obsessions that drove Stereo and Crimes of the Future with its telepathic conflict theme, offering a variation on both the central narrative of those two films and the body horror that so defined his work in the 1970s and 80s.
The pain begins in your flesh, in your brain. 15 seconds, you can't breathe. It chokes you. It destroys you. 20 seconds, you explode. Experience the terrifying power of scanners. Their thoughts can kill. Rated R.
The film tells the story of a new strain of humanity which has emerged thanks to the side effects of a drug used by pregnant women, and onto subtle reference to thalidomide. Around the world there are 237 of these so-called scanners who possess powerful telepathic abilities and who are being sought out by two conflicting factions. Consec, the shady corporation that manufactured the drug on the one hand, and radical terrorist scanner groups on the other. Caught in the middle of this battle is Cameron Vale, a highly powerful but directionless scanner who's recruited by Consec to track down the renegade telepaths and their leader Darrell Revok. Scanners was a notoriously chaotic production, though you'd never guess by watching it, a few minor plot holes and continuity issues aside. It's less an intimate film than his previous movies and feels close to the sci-fi action of the 1980s. When people express surprise that Cronenberg was linked to big-budget movies like Total Recall, it seems that they're overlooking this film, which showed that he was more than capable of handling explosive action scenes. And of course his 1978 film Fast Company, a no-nonsense exploitation movie set around drag racing, was probably a good learning ground for this. While it has a lot of interesting ideas and still explores Cronenberg's body horror obsessions, Scanner is also a fast-paced thriller with several spectacular set pieces. The most spectacular, of course, is the infamous exploding head, one of the most iconic scenes of all time, I would argue, and one that still looks impressively realistic and gruesome even today. If you want a scene to show why physical effects are so much better than CGI, this is it. The final scanner battle between Vale and Revok is also impressive. Reshot after the original finale proved ineffective, it mixes gore and intensity to provide a suitably explosive climax to the film. A pity then that the last scene of the movie falls rather flat. I won't go into why that is, because that'll certainly count as a spoiler, and I know how much everybody hates those. But I'll be interested to hear what you made of it. Let me know in the comments. The film is both helped and hindered by the cast. The supporting performers are great. Michael Ironside as Revok and Patrick McGowan as the Consec head Dr. Paul Ruth both bring a level of intensity to their roles, being compulsively watchable and dominating every scene they appear in. They're helped in this domination by Stephen Lack, though, who is pretty terrible as Cameron Vale. An artist dabbling in film acting, Lack delivers his dialogue entirely flatly, apart from a couple of moments where he seems to be acting as a role model for the room's Tommy Wiseau. A pity then that he's in most of the movie's scenes. Scanners is ultimately too good for him to wreck, but he comes worryingly close to doing so at times. Scanners was a box office hit, a rare Canadian film that broke through to the American audience in a big way. It was the film that finally brought Cronenberg to the attention of the major studios, who probably thought that his work would become more and more commercial as time went on. Of course, his next film, financed by Universal, was Videodrome, and after a couple more accessible films in the form of The Dead Zone and The Fly, he would start to take a decidedly more left-field approach to his work, with the literary adaptations of difficult novels and increasingly dark narratives that slowly shifted him away from the body horror themes, yet somehow remain intimately Cronenbergian. Inevitably, the box office success of Scanners, and more significantly its continuing popularity on video, made sequels inevitable. While Cronenberg had been briefly involved in the ill-fated idea of turning the film into a TV series in the early 1980s, he'd moved on by the time the sequel films came along. Scanners 2, The New Order, appeared in 1991 and essentially retold the original film in a less cerebral, more action thriller-based format. The film does present a neat twist on the original format, having the dysfunctional scanners being exploited by a right-wing police chief who uses them to dish out vigilante justice. There are some nice touches dealing with the addictive natures of the drugs used to control the telepaths too, and some good gore set pieces. If you are unaware of the original Scanners, you might well find this an impressively original movie. As well as aping the first film's broad story, Scanners 2 also throws in another exploding head, taking a dramatic image from the original film and turning it into a thematic point. The implication being that you can't have a Scanners film without an exploding head. It was obviously made with one eye on the prospect of further sequels, and although critics were generally dismissive, the target audience was fairly happy with the film, making a third installment inevitable. The third film arrived within 12 months of its predecessor, milking the market while it was hot in true video franchise style. However, stylistically, Scanners 3, The Takeover, is light years removed from the first two films, presumably because the lack of any continuing characters meant that each film had to re-establish itself within the context of audience expectations for a film called Scanners. While Scanners 2 had more or less followed the template laid down of the original film, this second sequel throws caution, along with common sense, good taste and any sense of restraint, to the wind, and in place of intelligent science fiction offers up a spectacularly cheesy exploitation movie. Opening up with a title scroll that informs us that scanners have been able to pass their powers down through generations, apparently having been able to raise children regardless of their previously explored social dysfunction. In fact, the film opens with a party where Scanner's guests are encouraged to show their powers as a party trick. Times have indeed changed for these misfits. But when one such trick goes badly wrong and results in a death, the Scanner responsible heads off to a monastery in Tibet to meditate and learn self-control. Meanwhile, his Scanner sister is experiencing headaches and agrees to try an experimental new drug which is hoped will help telepaths deal with the side effects of their condition. However, the drug has a curious side effect itself, turning her into a power-crazed megalomaniac who immediately hatches a plan to have scanners under her control take over the world. Vamping it up in a variety of ridiculous costumes, her character seems to have strolled in from a 60s Eurotrash superhero film, and it's all the better for it. It must be said that by commonly accepted standards, Scanners 3 is rubbish. The film flounders under a mishmash of awful dialogue, ludicrous overacting and substandard special effects. But once you accept that this is not going to be an intellectual experience, Scanners 3 is unquestionably entertaining. The excessive gore with several exploding heads, the entirely gratuitous nudity and the wild performances from most of the cast combine to ensure that this is a lot of fun if approached with minimal expectations. There's also the Scanner Cop series, none of which are worth watching, and the inevitable threat of a remake. One was announced in 2007 but as of 2025 has yet to appear. I'm not sure that we really need it. As for the new Second Sight editions, well, for those of you who don't already own copies of these two films, or for that matter, those of you who have early editions but want to upgrade to UHD, these beautifully packaged editions are well worth picking up. Each comes alongside the movie with a book of essays and a collection of, well, what would we call these? Postcards, art prints, art prints of images not from the film but new artwork, as is often the case with collectible new editions. And like many such editions, the cover has a little slip case so you can remove the bit with the back blurb and the BBFC certificates and have a much purer cover if that is what you wish to do. Here's the Scanner cover, which perhaps resembles the original sleeve artwork more, and with the iconic image on the back. Once again with the booklet of essays and the collection of art cards. Does the packaging and this additional material make these editions worth picking up? Well, that's a matter of taste. Personally, I think they look really gorgeous and stand out on your shelves, but for those of you who feel that this is just filler, you'll be glad to hear that both films are available in standard editions as well. I'd love to see Cronenberg's other early films getting a similar treatment to this. His 1970s work remains oddly underrated, and I think that those films have more relevance now than they probably did at the time. But what do you think? I'm interested to hear your thoughts on Cronenberg's films and these new editions. As ever, if you've enjoyed this exploration of classic cinema, you know what to do. Hit that like button and subscribe to Desperate Living so you don't miss any of our upcoming content. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again soon.